And so the Stevenson Lectureship Award this year, of course, goes to Dr. Joy Bernhardt from the University of Guelph, who's waiting patiently online. We appreciate you. And I'll just have a few words about Dr. Bernhardt. So Dr. Bernhardt is an integrative ecologist who researches, explores, and experiments issues related to the drivers of biodiversity change and their implications for human well-being, and of course, ecosystems. More specifically, her research addresses one of the most crucial scientific challenges that we face today, and that is, of course, making predictions about global change as they arise. And Dr. Bernhardt's work advances a solution to this challenge by studying, among other things, metabolic processes using theory, lab experimentation, field work, and really importantly, community and partnership engagement. And so, based on all the different nominations that came in, it's obviously clear that Dr. Bernhardt's research record is exceptional. Many of the authors of the letters suggested that not only is she a prolific author, but her publications, of course, represent substantial contributions to our field in general, whether it's through marine or freshwater ecosystems. And what I found fascinating by the nomination is it became very clear reading all the nomination letters that she has a very incredibly unique ability to connect ideas across scales and across subdisciplines. So a very unique skill, leading to truly novel and impactful work. Before I pass off to Dr. Bernhardt, I'll just read a couple of quick quotes from the nominators. One of the quick quotes I have here is Dr. Bernhardt is one of the outstanding scholars of her generation. And you don't see that very often in letters. Secondly, she demonstrates clear leadership in research with a drive that's enviable. Her energy is infectious, and she elevates those around her in all sorts of capacities. The last quote, Dr. Bernhardt is an exceptional scientist in every dimension, blazing trails in the science of ecology and evolution of populations and communities in a changing aquatic ecosystem. So these are all attributes that we really respect and obviously explain why she's the winner of this year's 2026 Stevenson Lectureship Award. So without further ado, we pass it off to Joy Bernhardt, who is here today online. But one of the exciting things that will come out of this is that she's offered to do a fireside chat in the future online so that students that aren't able to engage with her in person today will have an opportunity in the future. So with that, Dr. Bernhardt, thanks for joining us today.
Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. Jérôme, I have my phone here, so you can text me if you can't hear me or see me. But I will assume that you can, and we'll go forward from here. So thank you so much to Trevor for that really kind introduction. Thanks for allowing me to participate virtually. I'm really happy to see all the virtual participants online. And as Trevor mentioned, I'm looking forward to engaging with the IAGLR SPAS community in the coming year. And so for students and postdocs in the audience, and really anybody, if you're interested in chatting, stay tuned for an email in your inbox that will set up a webinar session where we can connect more. Okay, so today's talk is going to be centered on a bungee cord. And if you remember anything from today's talk, I hope you take away the bungee cord idea that I'll get to. But before I get into the bungee cord and the science that I do, I think it's important to tell you where I come from and how I come to this work as an ecologist and a biodiversity scientist. And so what I'm showing you here in this photo, this is a photo taken off the west coast of Vancouver Island. This is near where I grew up and where I got my start in ecology. And this is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And for me, as an ecologist and as a biodiversity scientist, it's important to recognize that the biodiversity that exists within these traditional territories exists because of thousands of years of stewardship on the part of Coast Salish people in the past, in the present, and ideally into the future. And what you're looking at here in this photo is not any old stretch of shoreline. This is actually a clam garden, which is an ancient form of aquaculture that Coast Salish people use to maintain high levels of shellfish productivity in the intertidal zone. And the abundance of these shorelines is reflected in one of my favorite traditional Coast Salish sayings: when the tide goes out, the table is set. And what I really like about this saying is that it evokes a living system in which human well-being and ecosystem health are intricately linked, not only through the food benefits provided by the shellfish, but also the cultural and spiritual benefits. The other component here, when the tide goes out, evokes a changing dynamic living system. And of course, systems like this that support livelihoods are not only experiencing daily tidal cycle changes, but they're also now experiencing rapid planetary scale change that is threatening the ability of these systems to support livelihoods as captured in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so I would argue that understanding how living systems at multiple scales respond to environmental change is the most important scientific challenge that we face over the next century. And this is the focus of my work. I aim to develop a mechanistic understanding of global change in aquatic ecosystems and the consequences of those changes for human health and well-being. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to this research and how the bungee cord fits in. So my interest as an ecologist in making connections to human health and well-being came from reading this book when I was an undergrad. This is the story of Paul Farmer, who was an amazing physician and public health researcher who dedicated his life to helping people access healthcare. And what I take from his life's work, among many things, is he really made the point loud and clear that if we want to provide effective medical care to people, we need to understand their whole lives, including their family context, everything even to the roads on which they travel to reach the clinic to get medical care. And all of these factors together influence their ability to access medical care and their outcomes. And the roads, of course, that people use to access medical clinics are, of course, influenced by ecosystem health. And this context became really clear to me when I was an undergrad. I took a year leave of absence from university and I went to Costa Rica and Ecuador. And at this point, the connections between human health and well-being and ecosystem health became really clear to me. I was living in an area that routinely experiences landslides that wipe out the roads. And of course, we know that the severity and the frequency of these landslides is made worse due to deforestation. When trees are removed from hillsides, the landslides get worse and roads get wiped out and people can't make it to the medical clinic for days while the roads are closed. And so this made clear to me that, the connections between human health and ecosystem health are really varied. And I came back, I knew that I wanted to do field biology and I knew I wanted to do something though that made connections to human well-being. And so I came back from this year abroad feeling really inspired to pursue a career in ecology, but with this motivation to do science that ultimately helps us improve conditions for human well-being. But where I landed when I first got back was with an honors thesis focused on rocky shore thermal ecology. This was a purely curiosity-driven thesis. I was interested in how rock size influences the rate at which rocks heat up and therefore affects rates of heat-related mortality. And so work like this, how I got started in this rocky shore thermal ecology, comes from a really different place from understanding connections to human well-being. At the outset, it seems this is really curiosity-driven work, and it started with this desire to understand how organisms interact with their environment without really an applied, immediate problem in mind. Of course, there are connections to climate change and ecosystem services, but that wasn't really the focus of this work. And so I started to, this was sort of when I kind of came across this tension, at least within myself as a young scientist, thinking about how I wanted to move forward. And it became really clear to me, though I love my work on rocky shores, that I wanted to be doing science that had the potential to directly connect to policy and to ultimately help us make better decisions in the immediate term. And this tension that I was feeling is reflected in this spectrum or this analogy of a bungee cord, which connects fundamental science or curiosity-inspired science with this more applied or use-driven science. And I like this analogy of a bungee cord because it tells us that there can be a tension between these two types of science. Sometimes they seem at odds with one another, between the science that's driven purely by our curiosity and science that solves immediate problems. But over the course of today's talk, I want to leave you with 3 take-home messages. And the first is that even though there might be a tension, that progress in one direction will always pull us forward on the other end. And so if we follow our curiosity in one way, inevitably this will ultimately lead to some applied context that will help us make better decisions. And vice versa, if we also follow where use and decision needs take us, we will inevitably have opportunities to improve our understanding of the fundamental components of our theory. The second key message that I want to leave you with is that in my experience, theory, whether it's mathematical theory or conceptual theory, is a common language that can help us link between these two ends of the bungee cord. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then finally, I want to encourage you if you're, wherever you think of yourself on the spectrum or wherever you see yourself on this bungee cord, I encourage you to find the thread that connects the two, because there always is a thread. And I also encourage you to do this in a way that brings you joy. So I'm going to start with an example from early in my PhD that was inspired by an applied context or a use-driven question. And this was this connection between seafood and human health. And I started my PhD reading this work and being really inspired by the work of Jessica Bogart and Shakuntala Tilsted, who were working in Bangladesh, where they were studying how people consume seafood, different types of species. And what they found is that over a 20-year period, even though people were consuming more seafood biomass overall, so their fish intake was higher overall, they actually had poorer health outcomes and leading to lower micronutrient intake and a problem called hidden hunger, in which people have access to sufficient protein and calories, but insufficient essential micronutrients. And over this same 20-year period, there was a switch in diets from relying on a highly biodiverse diet to a diet composed mostly of just one species, farmed carp. And so this led me to the question of, why would declining seafood biodiversity, why would this lead to worse health outcomes? And this is because, the benefits that we get from seafood are not about achieving, just our protein intake requirements or just our fat intake requirements. It's really about reaching a diversity of micronutrient intake or micronutrient and fatty acid targets simultaneously. And so it's really about this you can think about it as a multi-dimensional optimization problem. So I was interested in answering this question of linking between changes in biodiversity and natural systems and human health outcomes. And to do this, I drew on biodiversity ecosystem functioning theory, which was originally developed in agriculture context, but mostly in grasslands as well. And biodiversity theory predicts that for species to coexist within a system, they must differ in their resource niches, which leads to complementarity in resource use traits, and ultimately to a positive and saturating relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And this positive relationship has been observed in hundreds of experiments in grasslands and other systems. And we can estimate the strength of this relationship by fitting a power function to this relationship and estimating this scaling exponent B. Now, biodiversity ecosystem function relationships have been extended to the production of ecosystem services, but most of these extensions have been for services based on total yield. And as I just showed you, total yield does not equate to human well-being. And there are actually very few robust links in this framework to human health. And so beyond just testing for a pattern in the relationship between biodiversity and nutritional benefit, I was interested in testing for the mechanism that would lead to a biodiversity effect. And biodiversity theory predicts that if there's variation in nutrients among species with different ecological traits, and if those nutrient concentrations are either negatively related or uncorrelated among species, then biodiversity theory would predict that increasing species richness in a system should lead to increased nutritional benefit. And so I tested this theory in the context of seafood and human nutrition in this way by linking changes in diversity in the diet, which are shown on the left-hand side there, and using this framework to connect it all the way to human health and human well-being. And for today's talk, I'm going to focus on one metric of nutritional benefit that we came up with that's called minimum portion size, or P-min. And the middle graph there shows you that we expect, based on biodiversity theory, that as species richness increases, we expect the minimum portion size required to reach a given nutritional target should decrease. And this is a benefit from the perspective of human nutrition, because if we can reach our nutritional needs more efficiently, this has health benefits. So I tested this theory by assembling a very large database of seafood nutrient concentrations across more than 800 species of seafood. And here's what we found using this theory. First, draw your attention to the middle panel there. That middle panel shows the value of that scaling exponent B. In this case, a smaller number is better because if we can reach our nutritional needs more efficiently, this is beneficial from the perspective of human health. And I'll start by drawing your attention to the yellow line there, or the yellow dot. That dot, that value of that scaling exponent is basically 0. And you can see that reflected in the panel on the left, where yellow is the relationship for protein. And so what you can see is there's basically no benefit to increasing biodiversity in natural systems when it comes to protein provisioning. But that relationship changes when we look at the micronutrients like calcium, iron, and zinc, and the fatty acids, where now we start to see negative relationships, indicating that we can reach our nutritional targets more efficiently with less biomass if we increase seafood species richness. And this effect is even stronger when we consider all 5 micronutrients and fatty acids simultaneously. And if you remember from the perspective of human health, this is critical. Human health isn't just about achieving any one of those nutrient targets alone. It's really about reaching them simultaneously. And this is what's called a multifunctional or a multifunctionality effect in the biodiversity ecosystem functioning theory world. This has been hotly debated recently, and we've here now provided new insight into these multifunctionality effects by showing really strong effects in the context of human health. But one of the most exciting findings from this work, I was interested in why don't we see a positive effect of biodiversity on protein provisioning, but we do for calcium, iron, and zinc and the other micronutrients. And what I found is the reason for this is that protein concentrations, their distribution in natural assemblages is fairly symmetrical, whereas the calcium distribution is actually very highly skewed, which means that if we're including more species in our diet, we're more likely to include one of those high calcium species, and that's going to lead to a net biodiversity benefit. And to me, this is really exciting because the connection between trait distributions in communities and the potential biodiversity effects hadn't been widely appreciated. But I would argue this is a really powerful connection because it allows us to connect our understanding of the drivers of these trait distributions in communities to biodiversity effect outcomes. So I want to summarize this work by saying our main finding here and what I've demonstrated is a quantitative link between biodiversity and human well-being in the context of human health. What we find is that biodiversity is critical for the provisioning of micronutrients, but not for protein, and that it's essential to meeting nutritional requirements efficiently. And I want to highlight that in this case, because we use general theory here, this general biodiversity ecosystem functioning theory, we were able to compare the strength of the biodiversity effect that we saw in seafood to the strength of the biodiversity effect observed in grasslands and forests and other systems. And we found in this case that the effects are stronger or comparable or stronger in the case of seafood as we've seen in those other systems. Not only that, by drawing on general theory and applying it to this different context, we were actually able to discover something new about our fundamental understanding of the theory itself. This finding that trait distributions are really critical. And to me, that's really one of the most exciting parts of this work, when a really applied question and tackling an applied question can lead to a fundamental advance in our basic understanding. And that just kind of highlights this is an example of how letting ourselves be drawn by the bungee cord in one direction ultimately informed our fundamental understanding of the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning more generally. So I want to finish up by telling you about how this bungee cord has worked in the reverse direction in my own work. And I'm sure there are many other examples of people in the audience who can think of similar examples. And here I'm going to tell you about how my curiosity took me to an area of ecology that is now ending up to be really useful in an applied context in my current work. And so early on in my PhD, I also became fascinated by this idea that metabolic rates have really important implications in understanding processes in ecological systems. And one feature that's shared by all of life on Earth is metabolism. All living things must uptake resources from their environment. They must then transform these resources within their cells and then allocate the products of this transformation to the various processes underlying maintenance, growth, and reproduction. And as ecologists, the rate at which all of these processes occur is what we call the metabolic rate. And one of the most widely observed patterns among ectotherms is that metabolic rates increase with temperature. And not only is this observed across a really broad range of taxonomic diversity, but also the slopes of these relationships consistently reflect the temperature dependence of cellular respiration, which suggests that constraints operating within cells can propagate up to entire ecosystems. And this has really important implications for ecology because at its core, ecology is fundamentally metabolic. Essentially, all ecological interactions involve exchanges of energy and materials. And the idea behind metabolic scaling theory is that if we can understand how metabolic rates change with temperature, metabolic traits change with temperature, then we can harness that to predict ecological outcomes. In this case, predation rate of a sea star on mussels. But as a postdoc, I was inspired by my curiosity to answer this question of how do metabolic traits themselves evolve in changing environments? I became convinced early in my PhD that metabolic traits had really important consequences in predicting the dynamics of populations and communities. But I wanted to know how metabolic traits themselves can change in changing environments. And so I did a lab experiment in which I exposed populations of a model alga, Chlamydomonas reinhardtii, to several different resource limitation treatments like phosphorus limitation, nitrogen limitation, et cetera. And I asked how they respond to these changes in resource conditions. And in particular here drew on a theory called R star theory, where R star is the minimum resource level that supports positive population growth. And we know in a theoretical context can predict the outcome of competition. And so what I found is that over the course of this evolution experiment in the lab, that populations were able to evolve a lower R star for phosphorus, their P star, over the course of about 285 generations, which is relevant to seasonal timescales in lakes. Drawing on evolutionary theory, I predicted that I would see trade-offs between the ability to withstand low phosphorus and low nitrogen, or low phosphorus and low light. And those trade-offs would be reflected in a relationship that would be, showing up in these gray boxes here. But I found something really surprising, which is completely opposite to that, which is that we didn't find any evidence for adaptive trade-offs, but we actually found evidence for correlated or simultaneous improvements, where in this case, their ability to withstand low light was positively associated with their ability to withstand low nitrogen. And we think that's because these traits are all related via metabolic network. And I didn't know this at the time. There was no way to foresee it. But those experiments on the evolution of phosphorus, responses to phosphorus limitation, actually turned out to be directly relevant to work we're doing now in partnership with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, where we're studying the effects of phosphorus limitation on larval dicomeg or larval lake whitefish and habitat quality. And this has led to a really rich and positive partnership with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And in this context, we're learning even more about how these ecosystems work. And so I think this is a really nice example of the full feedback across this whole bungee cord, where ultimately a curiosity-inspired question led me to be prepared to answer a question that was of direct relevance to communities. And ultimately, we're now developing new theory, stoichiometry theory at the community level that will inevitably lead to some applied use. And I think the beauty of this is that the reason why these things are all connected is that ultimately the same metabolic processes are at play in an alga's life in a test tube as life in a lake. And I want to end here with a cautionary tale that that we move too much towards just purely focusing on applied science. And I'll end with this quote by a colleague of mine, Chuliang Song, though this has been said many times before, which is that a field that only solves today's applied problems eventually runs out of the fundamental insights needed to solve tomorrow's. And for that reason, I encourage us to both continue following our curiosity, but also always having an eye towards the potential applications. And I'm going to finally end here, which is my point of following your joy in all of this. And during my comprehensive exam preparation as a PhD student, I read this book called Macroecology by Jim Brown. And I'm one of those people who always skips ahead to the last page of a novel because I want to find out what happens. So I skipped ahead to the last page of this book, and I came across this quote, which says, "Trying to discover the laws that govern the abundance, distribution, and diversity of species is not for those who are timid or content to do easy science, but for those who are willing to think big, stretch themselves, and persevere. I cannot think of any human endeavor that is more challenging and more fun." And I love this quote so much that my lab mates engraved this for me on a wooden plaque, and I still have this to the day and I cherish it. And it reminds me to find the thing that fires you up and that you find fun and a source of joy and to follow that.